the hot topic that a lot of the viewers have been asking to have a conversation with you is that talk about U.S. policy and how does it work, particularly when it comes to Eritrea. Many of the diaspora hope for some positive influence, if there is any, from the current administration. And if you can just kind of share some of your input, how U.S. policy have been able to influence the region, particularly in Eritrea. If there are any outside players that we should be keeping in mind in current situations. So if you can talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, to begin with, I think you have to understand that the U.S., like any big power, is going to be guided by its own interests. That's number one. And it's never going to be anything else. Now, there can be different perceptions of that interest, and there can be different perceptions of how to pursue that interest. But U.S. national interest is going to be the first consideration. So if you're interested in influencing the U.S. relationship with Eritrea, you have to be able to make an argument that sees a coincidence of interest between what you're arguing for and what the U.S. stands to gain. It's not going to be a charity. It's not going to do something because it's morally right, even if it's Joe Biden or Barack Obama, or anybody else. And that's the way politics works. That's the way nations work. They act in their own interest. There can be various differences of opinion about what that interest is, as I said. But in the current situation, U.S. national interest in the region is served by strengthening counterterrorism activity, defending against the spread of Islamist extremism is one part of that, countering China's influence is another. I mean, in some other parts of the world, you could argue that it was economic interest, but I don't think there's a tremendous economic interest coming out of the Horn of Africa for the U.S. It's more about the negative interest of instability breeds humanitarian crises that generate demands for U.S. response and for money, resources, and so on. So instability also creates openings for terrorism and for other problems to infiltrate an area. So U.S. interest is, number one, about stabilizing the situation in the Horn and using that as a base of operations for trying to extend U.S. influence in the surrounding region and to prevent the growth of extremism in the region. There are other aspects of this too, but you need to really understand what U.S. interests are. Now, then you could argue about what best serves that interest. Now, the last administration, the Trump administration, which had an ideological inclination toward autocratic regimes, identified U.S. interests directly with those of the Saudis and the Emiratis and Egypt. So you could see that influencing the attitude toward the Horn from there. Ethiopia has, I'm afraid, always been the big kid on the block, so to speak, and has attracted the most attention from the U.S. So the U.S. interest in the area has been about how to have a relationship with a stable, strong Ethiopia, as well as Eritrea, Sudan, Djibouti, and so on. If you pit Eritrea versus Ethiopia, it's going to be a very hard case to make that Eritrea is more important than Ethiopia because of a much larger country with tremendous influence in the continent as well. It's the headquarters for economic activity, for diplomatic activity. Ethiopia has been involved in peacekeeping operations in the surrounding area that meet U.S. interests in other areas. You're not going to see them walk away from that. Now, the instability in Ethiopia today raises some questions about the U.S. policy and how to pursue it. But the idea that humanitarian or human rights concerns would cause the U.S. to shift to support for Eritrea over Ethiopia, I think is naive. The interest U.S. has is having a peace between Eritrea and Ethiopia and a peaceful relationship there that could be the cornerstone of an alliance that would strengthen the whole region. I mean, there are a lot of arguments for the U.S. having a stronger relationship with Eritrea. Eritrea has been a troublemaker in the region for U.S. policy in many respects, but it also has the ability to be a force for stability and peace. The Eritreans have always understood, this includes the Isaias regime, understood the way Somalia works, the way Sudan works. It can be a force, a constructive force in any of those areas if it wants to be. I don't see that happening right now, but it could be. And the idea of having the relationship between Eritrea and Ethiopia be the base of U.S. interest in the region has long been the goal for the U.S. That has not been possible, in part because of the conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and because of the relationship between the U.S. and Isaias Afwerki. He has been a very difficult person to work with. Oh, repeatedly. You know, the U.S. and Eritrea do not have embassies. They don't have ambassadors in each other's countries. We have a chief of mission. They have a chief of mission. And it's been that way for like...
I don't know if there's like any long-term friend that has been with Isaias. And I think in our early discussion, you talked about, you know, who's been his allies, long-term friends, and just kind of like talk about a little bit on that. And then we'll go to the second part of this question, which is basically what could the diaspora do, and then any transitional government.
Sure. If you go back to the 1970s and the EPRP, the party, had a political manual that it used for its political education within the EPLF. In that, it laid out who are Eritrea's strategic friends and its allies and who aren't. There was a very rigid ideological take on that. And it was built around the classic socialist analysis of the working class, the Soviet Union, the socialist countries, and so on. The Soviet intervention in 1977-78 blew that up, basically. And it made everybody rethink. And I think Isaias particularly came out of that into a kind of radical nationalist politics that said Eritrea first. Like make Eritrea great again, maybe. But it was Eritrea first. And he came out of that, I think, convinced that there aren't any strategic allies for Eritrea. There's nobody you can trust. I mean, and I understand where that comes from, because the U.S. had stabbed it in the back several times. The Soviet Union stabbed it in the back in 1977, having been a big backer, and all of a sudden, no. Now that Ethiopia is socialist and our ally, you have to put away your demand for independence and come with us. The African National Congress in South Africa, which had been a steadfast supporter of Eritrea, all of a sudden did the same thing, following in the path of its relationship with the Soviet Union. Yemen, which had been an ally of Eritrea, turned around and sent tanks and fighters to fight on Ethiopia's side against the struggle. I mean, you know, there were a lot of bad lessons there. So Isaias came out of it convinced that there was nobody he could trust, which left him also thinking that I can work with anybody as long as it's in my interest and in my perception of Eritrea's interest at the time. So if that isn't too crazy, it means if you can't trust anybody, you don't have to trust them, but you can work with there's nobody you can't work with, because they're all basically alike. So that meant that Eritrea has at various times been drawn to Israel, to Iran, to Libya, to now lately the Saudis and the Emiratis. But none of those relationships are stable, and everybody who works with Eritrea knows that. So the Saudis know that very well. The Emiratis know that. They make the decision that they're working with Eritrea because it suits them at the time. and the Egyptians the same. So the whole region is now being driven by short-term interest, which is a very dangerous situation to be in.
And in that space, could you see a diaspora based like a transitional government or strong like influencers to make a better change inside Eritrea?
Well, this is a perennial question. I do not see the prospect of an outside government, a government in waiting. That has to have a base of active support inside a country to work. So for example, the African National Congress built this very strong organization outside the country. It also had a very strong organization inside South Africa with the trade union movement, women's movements, and so on. Where is that in Eritrea? So the idea of creating an alternative that would just come back in and implant itself, it's almost like colonizing Eritrea from the outside. I hate to say it. And it's not going to work. However, Eritrea is a transnational country. Its population is out as much as it is in. And it's very actively engaged. So the population has to be involved in Eritrea's future. And the fact that it's only involved now through paying diaspora taxes and kowtowing to the leadership is a tremendous weakness of the state itself. I see the diaspora as being critical to Eritrea's future, but as a partner with people inside. Now, the inside question is the big difficult one here, because you can't see any organization there except when Yaakov posters go up in Asmara. It's not like South Africa, where you have a trade union movement or lawyer movement or a professional movement like you had in Sudan when they did the uprising there. But I do think that Eritrea's future will be resolved through some partnership between internal forces and external forces. And the outside people can do what maybe you can't do on the inside, and that is to prepare for that by getting engaged with social activities like what's going on now with the support for the refugees in Sudan. It can be involved in organizing itself professionally to provide resources for Eritrea afterward. It can come up with ideas about how Eritrea might look like as a democratic country. And we have to stop for a second and talk about what democracy is. But, and put those ideas out there so that people inside can talk about them, think about them, even if in private, because now you can't have public discussions. But the generation of ideas is part of a transformational process. So that's really important. But if the outside forces are going to have any influence inside, there has to be a greater level of unity than there is now, for one. And there's no way that an outside power like the US, Britain, the EU, or anybody else is going to support a government in waiting if it doesn't have anything to show for itself as a tie-in to the situation inside. It's just not realistic. They're going to deal with what is, and the US is going to do that. The EU is going to do that. You may want to influence how they do that, whether it's through a combination of aid and pressure or carrot and stick. But you're not going to get any big government involved in the area to walk away from Eritrea altogether. They can't afford to. So you have to find some way to have influence without trying to create an alternative that would be the choice between working with Asmara or you.
Yep. No, I think, you know what, Dan, there is something important that you mentioned, which is really making a big influence from social and economical and kind of allowing the people inside the country to have a confidence in the diaspora that they will be able to extend the help that they need post-Isaias.
Yeah, exactly. What can you do for them? And
exactly.
People, yeah, that's
and then I think that's something that the Yaakov, it's a movement, you know, and many people really are having a deep conversation and creating organization on a professional level, and not just only from the aid aspect of it, but, you know, the healthcare organizations, the Law Society of Eritrea, journalists, artists, many of them are now realizing what we have to make a meaningful contribution for the people inside the country, and not just like hold a sign that says down, down Isaias, right? So I think that's a really, really key point. The other part that I want you to discuss, and, you know, I promise we're coming to the end of our conversation, is what do you see post Isaias? So let's say we wake up tomorrow, the man has fled, died, whatever the conversation is. Do you see like a military coup d'etat, or do you see a popular uprise to just kind of make a change, or do you really see this a transition of a dynasty dictatorship where it goes to a family member or a close relationship to Isaias?
I don't think that it's going to go to a family member. Start there and work backwards. I don't think Eritrea is North Korea, and where you can have this kind of socialist monarchy that passes from generation to generation. I could be wrong, of course, but that would really surprise me. It's very hard to tell after that. There are a lot of possibilities. The only organized institution in the country, really, at this point, is the military. So the chances are good that the military will have a key role in whatever comes next. There is also the possibility of a transition that could involve some kind of transitional council that would be drawn from the forces that already exist in Eritrea. That would be, unfortunately, PFDJ, the military, the national security forces, and others. I think from their standpoint, if they wanted to manage a transition that kept the control, they would have to do something like that. There's no one individual, I think, that could step in and be the next Isaias. There would be a balance of contending power centers within Eritrea, perhaps, and it would be held together by a council of that sort with a neutral party running it. The best case scenario would be that these people would see that Eritrea was in basically a cul-de-sac, had dug a hole for itself, and it needed to get out of it with the diaspora. And the diaspora would be invited to come in and participate in that. I do not think that you want to take an approach that says from the outside, we have to do away with everything we don't like. The PFDJ, everybody who's been involved in it has to go. That is the example that happened in Iraq recently, in the 2000s, with the de-Baathification of the country, and the result was ISIS and the fragmentation of the country into civil war. That would be a disaster because the country has been deinstitutionalized. That's a tremendous weakness. That's been part of Isaias's ability to stay in control, but he has also left the country really crippled from the standpoint of state building. You have a parliament that hasn't met since 2002, a government where the foreign minister goes to have meetings with people and he's shadowed by Yamani Gabrab, who's also the foreign minister in waiting or in disguise. You have this institutional facade with a power center just below the surface that is managing most things. What do where is that going to go for the next generation? It has to be rebuilt in many ways. This is where the diaspora can play a critical role in creating, as you were describing, the institutions, the civil society institutions that become the building blocks for going forward. Those have to be mirrored by that kind of work inside as well. But I I think the transition for Eritrea after this is going to be a long one. The best case I would see would be a transitional period of about probably 4 years, during which time several things would have to happen. The Constitution would have to be revisited and revised and readopted. There would have to be a structure that would allow for the identification of peace and reconciliation process, similar to what went on in South Africa. Some kind of truth and reconciliation that would involve the acknowledgement of responsibility for terrible things and the acceptance of that on the part of the population so you could move forward. Some people probably disqualified from participating, but only some. But I can't answer that. I think that democracy, just to get back to that, is a contested notion. And it's been contested in the wider world as well as within Eritrean culture for decades. There are the traditional socialist definition was built around economic and social equality. The traditional Western notion has been around political equality. My own view is one that builds on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which suggests that it's all of those things together. I don't think that you can have a true democracy in the end means participation and accountability. And there are many ways to do that. Elections are one, elder councils are another, but accountability, there's no accountability in Eritrea now for the government. So there are new ways to build that could be uniquely Eritrean. I don't think uniquely any particular country is likely. It's not the way the world has ever worked, but I know there's this illusion that everything is different in Eritrea and none of the rules that apply to others apply to them. But learning from the experience of others would be really crucial at this point. I hope that people in the diaspora will pay more attention to processes in Rwanda, South Africa, Sudan, where have other countries dealt with trauma, political and social trauma, and reinvented themselves. But whatever happens, I hope that it embraces a concept of social, economic, and political equality and openness, because in the end, you can't really have a democracy that's strictly political while you have deep economic and social inequalities. We see that with the US, with racism and with inequality, economic inequality, and the way money drives politics. You see the opposite in situations where there is supposed economic equality and no political equality. Because if you don't have power, if you have economic equality one day, you can lose it the next. So, I mean, I think we need to be creative in thinking, what does democracy mean and how do you get there and what is it like to have? I think we also have to get away from the idea that it's a thing we can define in a way, put it in a box and say, okay, we're democratic or we're not. Democracy, as I've certainly learned, is something that you have to keep fighting for, that it changes, and that it's a struggle that is always renewed.
Yep, awesome. So I know we've come up to our time, and I wanted to mention something really important for our viewers. Where can we learn more about the studies that you've done, books you've written, essays you've contributed? I know there's hundreds of them in there. I've looked at many of your interviews on YouTube, but just kind of quickly tell our viewers, where can they learn more from your work?
Well, I've had a website for many years that is down this week, but it's where I have links to, well, my own autobiography a little bit. It also has links to my books and it has links to articles. It's danconnell.net. It's very simple. Dan Connell, Connell. While we were on this interview, I saw an email came in from WordPress saying they had reconstituted it. It is not taken down by any evil conspiratorial force out there. It was just the screw up in the technology of my webmaster.
Awesome.
But it will be back up this week, and that is one place to go. My latest book was the Historical Dictionary of Eritrea, which is, as you can see, a fat encyclopedia. It's based on a book that was first done by Tom Killian in the 90s that I revised and published under both of our names in 2010, and then I did another issue last year. It's an encyclopedia of fairly short entries that gives you some way to navigate, and especially for others, non-Eritreans who may want to learn more. It's a very expensive book, unfortunately, so you have to get it in the library. Don't even bother to try to spend your money on it. I am working on a memoir right now that will also tentatively called Eritrean Journeys, Mine and Theirs, which will be somewhat autobiographical, and also the story of people I've been meeting over the last 6 years in interviewing refugees about why they left, how they got out, and what their vision of a future Eritrea is. There are other people writing about this situation also who I think are certainly worth taking a look at. I've done like a 70-page bibliography on Eritrea for the back of the dictionary with all the resources I could think of. I think that since you've asked me this, I'm going to go back and try to put together a suggested bibliography and put that up on my website.
Yeah, it would be really awesome. I think a lot of times our understanding of the political sphere of Eritrea is very distorted. You know, either you've grown up in the US like myself and you have like just a really deep opinion about what has gone wrong and, you know, not really understanding what's on the ground, or you've been there and you've grown up with a different ideology. So there's a disparity of understanding from like a neutral perspective, or just learning the basics of that. So I think it's ideal to put a list of essays, reports, books to read to get a context of it from a different corner of our political movement and our government and historic of.
You know, I also, there are a few Eritreans I have a great respect for, young Eritrean writers, young to me at 76. Awat Wolde Michael.
Yep. I actually have a book of his not too far from me. That no, not this one, but yes, I've gotten a few of his book. He's a professor out in Canada. Yep.
Yeah, in Canada at Queen's College.
Yes.
Michael Wildemariam at Boston University, where I am, is another one. Barakat Haile has been with us for decades, longer even than I have. And I still take tremendous inspiration from him. And there are others. I think there are many Eritrean writers who are thinking about this. And I think the more that there are Eritrean voices speaking about these things, the stronger it will be. Because, you know, I have been engaged for so long here. I have enormous respect for the people of Eritrea, for the ability to pick yourself up when getting knocked down and to build anew, and also to think in new ways about the future. So,
okay. So you got to give me a short answer on this, and then we'll end the conversation. If you've gotten a chance to go post Isaias and things are just peace and making a transition, would you move to Eritrea? If so, where would you reside?
I would love to be part-time in Eritrea, but I have a life here as well. I am a person split between two countries and two identities, in a sense. Eritrea has become so much a part of my life that I can't think much about the world without thinking about where it is and who it is and where I fit in. I would love to get back. I would love to have a place to live there, but it would be a kind of shuttle back and forth.
And where would you stay?
Well, you know, This is a tough one. I always liked Ginda and Karen because they were in the kind of halfway area between the highlands and the lowlands. But, you know, Asmara, of course, is the center of so much that it would probably end up being closer to that.
Awesome, awesome. Well, Dan, thank you so much for really giving us the opportunity to sit down with you. We hope this is not the last one, and promise to give us more of your time. I just want to make a quick announcement at 4 p.m. at the Baito Yaakov. We'll make an announcement on the upcoming demonstration condemning Isaias and Abby's involvement in the country's affair. So hopefully you guys tune in at 4 p.m. and let's thank Dan for really giving us a great opportunity to look at Eritrea through his lenses. Dan, it's a pleasure chatting with you, and thank you for your time.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to more conversations with us, and I'm looking forward to more attention from the administration in Washington on the situation in the Horn and more constructive work to move it forward. Cool. And I will do whatever I can to encourage it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dan.
Natina, can I ask one quick question? I'm sorry to bring it at the end. Dan, what do you advise Yaakov to create connections with the study groups in the U.S.? That question came to me when you mentioned Michael Waldemariam of Boston.
Yeah. Well, let me just step back to talk about the U.S. government again, because we kind of left that off. Maybe I was too long-winded earlier. The U.S. government functions on foreign policy through the State Department and through the National Security Council. State Department is a key connection point, but it also functions through the Congress. And, you know, we talked before about the way nations operate. They operate depending on what they perceive their interest to be, and you have to be able to match that. You have to do the same with Congress. The Congress and the government in general are very responsive to constituencies that they perceive to be out there that can support them. Voting constituencies are critical to that. So if you can demonstrate a significant base of support that cares about one thing, whatever it is, peace in Eritrea, you know, the end of the state of emergency and the limitations on national service, whatever it is, you can lobby Congress, and you can also lobby the State Department through the demonstration of an active constituency. You have actually got an Eritrean in the Congress, Joe Negussi. You've got others who are having influence on Congress. Identify the members of Congress who you think are open to your concerns and work with them. Work with people in their offices. Often the relationships you build at the office itself are more important than the person who holds the office at the top, because you can engage with them on a more active way. You have a State Department that is being reconstructed after being practically dismantled and deinstitutionalized under the last administration. You have a lot of people in the State Department who are interested in Eritrea, have some knowledge about it. Linda Thomas Greenfield, who will be at the UN, has an intimate knowledge of the Horn of Africa from her work there before as the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs. I know she's met Isaias. She's been in Eritrea. Isaias didn't want to talk to her at the time, but that's typical. But you know, she is somebody, and she is a cabinet level appointee who is right there in New York. I think having a contact in her office, maybe not with her, but with somebody else in the office to channel your interest in Eritrea's role in the world and your concerns about America's relationship with Eritrea, that's an avenue. We have a new ambassador to Ethiopia, Gita Pasi, who is just preparing to go. She should be over there next week. She is a fresh face and a fresh voice on the Horn in general. You have a guy named Steve Walker, who is in the embassy in Stephen Walker, who is the chargé d'affaires, the chief of mission in Asmara, who has been there now for a year. He is also somebody to follow up with in different ways. And there are desk officers who work on Eritrea in the State Department. Those desk officers can be more important to you as an avenue into influencing policy than trying to get to Blinken, the Secretary of State, because you just won't get to him. So my advice is go to the intermediate levels, try to make connections, explain why they should care what you have to say, and then say what you have to say. Now, I'm not sure that's the answer to the question that was asked, but it was a question that I wanted to get back to. Tualdo?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Thank you. I was also hoping you may add to, for example, the Institute for Peace, the other study groups, because the foreign policy of the U.S. usually is based off of their research and presentations they give to the Congress and other offices. So the reason I remember that question is I saw Mikhail Waldemariam being one of the panelists at the USIP, exactly.
Yeah, no, and he's on a sabbatical now, I think, in Washington for the year. So Michael is a good person into that. The USIP has been important. The Atlantic Council has had some influence, but they've been so wrapped up with the regime and with Isaias that they're really perceived as being fairly limited. The Brookings Institution is another one that is worth looking at and talking to people there. What else? You know, I'm not sure. There is the World Peace Institute up in Boston at Tufts University, Alex Duvall, who is a potential avenue for this. I'll think about that and try to get back.
Yes, yeah. So you will connect us with whoever you have connections with. That was the main view that I wanted to clarify. Thank you.
I think that there are a lot of people who know about Eritrea who have been very frustrated with the inability to work with the country until now, but who would jump in a minute if the opportunity were there in a constructive way. Maybe some in an unconstructive way too. So be careful.
I love your sense of humor, Dan. You definitely have spent a lot of time with Eritreans because communication is with the humor a little bit. So I appreciate your time again. I know we're well past into the hour, so I want to thank our viewers. There's a lot of people who really in the comment section thanking you and eager to hear more from you. So there's probably a lot of inquiries coming in to hear more from you in particular topics, and we appreciate if you extend us your time in the future as well.
Gazabkum, Dan Connell.
Yeah,
All right, Paulina may end it.